We've had a debate here this afternoon about economic growth, and one of the realities now on both sides of the aisle, we agree that the tax relief that we're putting out there, which is helping middle-class families to be able to have a little healthier family budget, but also helping workers with regard to the international competition. Right now, our workers are competing with one hand tied behind their back, that all of this is going to generate more economic growth. It's going to come from more investment, more productivity. And in fact, the number that the Joint Committee on Taxation put out today, although it's significantly lower than other numbers, is over $400 billion in more revenue coming in. So enough growth that it will generate that much more revenue coming into the federal government.
That's based upon an assumption that the growth rate in the economy for the next decade is going to be 1.9%.
Exactly. But so that's the number. Let's say roughly $400 billion that they have. By the way, there are 137 economists who tell us that it will be not $400 billion, but it'll be $1 trillion. And this is their quote. Their letter came out yesterday. It said, economic growth will accelerate if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passes, leading to more jobs, higher wages, better standard of living for the American people. This is 137 economists who say, actually, it's going to be more than twice as much as joint tax says. And there are other studies, you've talked about some of them, that indicate there'll be even more economic growth. But
and we're already seeing that, right? I mean, the economy
we're
is
already
starting
seeing
to
it.
pick up.
So that's one part of the debate, is how much economic growth is going to come out of these tax reforms that we're putting forward. We know it'll be a lot. The question is how much. But this is all based on a Congressional Budget Office estimate of growth over the next 10 years, the GDP growth, the economic growth. So we're sort of in a straitjacket that, although we believe this tax reform proposal will help in terms of that growth, we have to go by this number of 1.9%. And 1.9% is anemic growth. I mean, that's sad. If we can't do better than 1.9%, we got real problems in this country. And that's for the next 10 years projected. As you have said, it's kind of interesting. They're projecting 1.9%. Others are projecting higher numbers. In the context of us just having finished a quarter that was 3.3%. It was adjusted yesterday to 3.3%. And then the quarter before, the second quarter this year, 3%. So 3%, 3.3% the last two quarters, and yet they're saying 1.9%. Now, again, there's others out there. There's a private forecast I saw earlier this week that indicates between 3% and 4% growth next year. The average, as you said, since World War II is far higher. Even the last 30 years with a lot of recessions and hurricanes and other natural disasters, it's 2.5% or more. So this is not normal. In other words, this is a relatively low rate. And I know we can do better. I don't say, as some do, that this is somehow the new normal. We've got to do better. If we don't do better, we can't begin to get wages back up again, which have been flat really for the past couple of decades when you take inflation into account. We know we can do better. And that's one reason this tax reform is so important, to give the economy that shot in the arm. But let's assume for a minute that it will only be 1.9% growth, dismal growth. Let's assume this tax proposal passes. Let's assume we get the benefit from the increased revenue in that. And by the way, what we say in the tax reform proposal is about $1.4 to $1.5 trillion of tax relief will be a part of this. That's out of $44 trillion over the next 10 years that will come in revenue. We're saying let's have a little bit of a tax relief because we know that the growth will make up for that. So let's assume that this is true. Let's assume you use the right policy baseline, assuming that we're going to continue with the current extenders, which we always do. We end up, and stick with me here, with about $533 billion deficit over the next 10 years if you assume this really low rate of growth. If you assume that instead of 1.9%, we go not to 3%, not to 2.5%, not even to 2.4, 2.3, 2.2, but let's just say 2.1% growth. Again, very conservative, and I sure hope we're going to do better than that. I believe we will. But let's assume it's 2.1%. That will generate enough revenue, because it's roughly $270 billion per every 0.1%, to have this tax reform proposal actually result in money going back into the Treasury. In other words, reducing the deficit. So I think this is very fiscally responsible. I think it is very conservative. I think 2.1% growth is not something that is at all out of bounds. In fact, I think it's going to be far higher than that based on the growth we've already had recently and the growth that's projected in the future by outside forecasters. So I would just say to folks who are hearing about this somehow blowing a hole in the deficit, I think just the opposite. I think it's going to actually result in more money going into the federal treasuries to be able to get the deficit down. And let me say something else, and I think this is a debate we can have, but we've got to deal with the growth side if we're going to get the debt and deficit under control. There's no question about it. It can't just be done on the spending side. We've got to get this economic growth going. But even to do the important work we have to do on a bipartisan basis to restrain growth, it's much more likely we do it when we have higher growth. If we're at 1.9%, we're not going to get there. So let's do some pro-growth tax reform. Let's get this economy moving. Let's give people the sense that we can tackle these problems. Let's do something about the debt and deficit. And we can do that, again, by very meager growth, 2.1% versus 1.9%, and actually take money that is currently in the economy at 1.9%, not moving much. Let's get it moving more. Let's create more economic activity. Let's do that to get that growth rate up a little bit through this tax reform, and then let's actually begin to reduce that debt and deficit. So I just wanted to make that point. When you hear about this is somehow fiscally irresponsible, I think it's very responsible fiscally, very conservative. I think we'll do better than the numbers that we've seen here, 1.9% growth, certainly just 2.1% growth that actually reduces the deficit, and I think that ought to be brought into the debate here.